Welcome to No Script, No Problem on Believe, the #1 podcast network for professionals. I'm your host, Steve Berkowitz, and as always, we'll be diving into the world of filmmaking and the ever-changing landscape of the entertainment industry. We've got a packed show for you today. Before we get to our special guest, here's your reality check. First up, Comcast is making headlines as they consider spinning off their cable companies into a new entity. This move could reshape the telecommunications landscape. By that, I mean entertainment as a whole. This will have significant implications for content distribution. That's if it actually happens. The president of Comcast teed this up in their most recent earnings call. The cable networks under consideration for this move would be MSNBC, CNBC, USA Network, E! Sci-Fi, Oxygen, True Crime, Universal Kids, and Spanish language channel Universo. This could have a massive impact on the unscripted TV industry. Stay tuned for updates. There are some positive TV and film news. In California here, Governor Gavin Newsom is pushing for an increase to the state's film credit program, proposing to expand it from $330 million a year to $750 million a year. This would allow California to better compete with Georgia, Canada, the UK, Australia, and Ireland. As I've noted before, we are losing production jobs to many other states and very specifically overseas. Now, the bad news here is that unscripted television is not included in this new proposal. This is particularly concerning as reality television jobs are rapidly leaving the state and country, I'm looking at you, Fox, with production at its lowest level in years. Next up, a fascinating new study has revealed that there's a greater interest in independent film than most people think. I'm including scripted and documentaries in here. This is exciting news for filmmakers, distributors, and audiences alike, suggesting a potentially untapped market for diverse and innovative storytelling. It's there, folks. I'm telling you, invest in it. And lastly, Netflix continues to defy expectations. Their most recent earnings report shows continued growth despite analyst predictions to the contrary. Specifically, Netflix added 5.9 million subscribers in Q3, bringing their total to 247.15 million global subscribers. From an influence standpoint, their only competition really is YouTube. YouTube went over the $50 billion mark in 12-month sales. The bulk of that money, about $36 billion, came from advertising, but that means the company now makes more than $10 billion from subscriptions like YouTube TV and YouTube Premium. At $50 billion in revenue, YouTube is about 30% larger than Netflix. But we don't know if it makes any money. Most outside estimates put YouTube at about break even, while Netflix reported revenue of $8.54 billion, up 7.8% year over year, and net income of $1.68 billion. Okay, enough of that. Now I am thrilled to introduce my guest, Natalie Hewit. Natalie is the talented director behind the captivating adventure documentary Endurance, which you can watch on Nat Geo, Disney Plus, or Hulu. This National Geographic film tells the incredible story of Sir Ernest Shackleton's brave expedition to Antarctica in 1914. It blends historical footage with an epic modern-day search for the shipwreck and a legendary tale of survival. In my conversation with Natalie, we explore the challenges of filming in extreme conditions, the innovative use of AI technology in documentary storytelling, and how Natalie balanced the historical narrative with the modern-day expedition. Before we get to the interview, here's the trailer to give you a taste of this riveting documentary.
We ready? Yes.
Okay, let's find the Endurance.
We're still talking about Shackleton because this is the greatest tale of survival in history. And it's a story about failure.
Success awaits. Dive ones, let's go.
In 1914, Shackleton was convinced the greatest Antarctic journey was yet to be done, crossing the Antarctic continent from one side to the other. So he dragged his men on a doomed quest.
We tried once before, in 2019, to search for the Endurance. It felt like my whole life had been converging upon that moment, and then it all went wrong.
Imagine being here in a little wooden boat, no GPS, no nothing. And then the leader says, oh, by the way, boys, we're stuck and we're going to spend the winter here.
We watched the death of the ship. Shackleton said to the men, she's gone, boys.
From that moment on, he's laser focused on getting those men home.
Now we're stuck on ice and losing time.
Patient.
Comment est-ce qu'on peut être quelque chose qui s'inscrit dans l'histoire de Shackleton et renoncer?
We're not finding anything at all, and temperatures are going to go off a cliff, and we'll have to call the search off.
As long as we can come out of this predicament with our lives, we shall not crumble. Why we go, I cannot say.
Today's the day.
What the impelling force is that makes explorers, I cannot describe. But as long as there is any mystery on this globe, it is not only man's right,
Oh my God, look at that.
but his duty to try to unravel it.
Okay, without further ado, here's my interview with filmmaker Natalie Hewit. Natalie Hewit, welcome to No Script, No Problem.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, I'm psyched to talk to you. All right, the film is Endurance. It's National Geographic documentary films. Before we dig into the film, I want to talk a little bit about you as a documentary filmmaker and why documentaries? What got you into this amazing world of nonfiction storytelling?
Wow, what a question. Well, I started when I was born. No, not really. Do you know what? As a kid, I wasn't one of those people who knew what they wanted to be when they grew up. I was always really jealous of those people who kind of knew they wanted to be a vet or a doctor or whatever. But I think looking back now, I think the thing that I always had was that I loved stories. Like I when I was literally like 6 or 7 years old, I got obsessed with watching like these animated Shakespearean plays on the BBC. And I think my mum was a bit like, why is my 6-year-old watching like Shakespeare? But I just love stories. And as I grew up, I started kind of getting into theatre, and I studied theatre for a long time. But I kind of knew I didn't want to be an actor. I still wasn't quite sure, but I finished college and ended up with a job at the BBC. And I'd always wanted to work at the BBC since I was a tiny, tiny kid. I just loved what they did. I just thought they were amazing. I remember going on a tour of the BBC studios when I was like 10 or something and just being in complete awe. And that was kind of my real entry into making films. I started out working in kind of like education and events, but I moved over into making TV programs. And my career started in the BBC Science Unit. So I was making science films, and I knew nothing about science. I hated science at school. It was the one subject that I just couldn't get on with. And I found it somewhat ironic that that's where I started my career, because everyone around me had kind of PhDs in various physics and biology and all these other things. And I was kind of, my first job, I was phoning up all these like eminent scientists from around the world and trying to get them to explain, 30 years of research to me in like a half-hour conversation, which was, an education in itself. But the skills that I developed there in terms of understanding how to turn real life and stuff that's actually maybe quite hard conceptually to get your head around, how to turn that into compelling storytelling. I think it kind of brought together my two interests of kind of like storytelling and the world, like the world around me. I was always really interested in trying to understand the world around me. And so it was a really, really great place to learn and to cut my teeth. But after a couple of years in making science films, and I'd made some other films as well. I made some films about people who survived violent crime, and I worked with an amazing director who's still a very good friend of mine to make a film about kind of post-traumatic growth, which is something that doesn't get spoken about a lot, but was absolutely fascinating. And that was sort of my first real introduction, I guess, to documentary making. And it was, I'm forever grateful for that experience, because the director I was working with taught me so much about how to work with contributors, and particularly contributors who have who are in very challenging situations, and how to have those really difficult conversations, which often you end up having as a documentary maker. So after a few years at making science films, which was super fun, you know, they're really fun things to make and so interesting, but I had this kind of, I've always had this interest in like humans and what makes us who we are and what makes us tick and what motivates us, what drives us, what makes us different from each other and what unites us. And I think I just wanted more time and opportunity to make films about, you know, the human condition, really. And so I started kind of moving into documentary making. And actually, the first documentary that I ever shot and directed was in Antarctica. So back in kind of 2016, I got a call from an old boss of mine, and he phoned me up and left a voicemail, which basically said, "Hey, Nat, do you want to go to Antarctica for 3 months on your own to make a film for the BBC? I need to know by tomorrow lunchtime." And I kind of got this voicemail and was sort of quite stunned and sort of like probably didn't have any words for about half an hour. I was just like, oh my gosh. And I was kind of at this point in my career, you know, I'd been producing for a long time, but I'd really wanted to direct my own films. I kind of knew that this was probably my break, you know, this was my chance to start directing. But I also had just finished a series for the BBC where it'd been an expedition series. We'd been up in the Canadian Yukon on this expedition, and two of our expedition guides that we had with us were polar explorers. Like they both did loads of work in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And, you know, we were on this expedition, and in the evenings of this expedition shoot, we'd be round the campfire and they would start telling these stories about their Antarctic expeditions. And they were horrendous. Like I literally was listening to these stories being like, this sounds horrendous. Like, why would you ever want to go there? It's like super cold. It's super isolated. You're living in tents. Like there were stories about poos freezing in the toilet. Like I was just like, this sounds awful. And then obviously 2 months later, I get a phone call being like, do you want to go? And I was like, I mean, I do, because I'm so intrigued about why people do this. Like I could not understand why people would voluntarily kind of leave their lives and go to the end of the world and live in complete isolation. I was so intrigued. I felt like I have this a lot when I'm like, if I don't understand something, I kind of need to explore it until I do understand it. And I think that's what really drove me to say yes, because I was like, I don't understand this and I really want to. So I said yes. And about 2 months later, I was boarding one of many flights to get to Antarctica.
Well, this explains so much about why you were able to succeed as the director of Endurance. That's why I'm so glad I asked you about your background first. All right. Well, I have one follow-up there, which is something that I talk to other filmmakers about. Do you feel like jumping into a project where you don't know a lot about the subject matter is actually a lot of times a good thing, because you're more inclined to dig in and focus on learning about the people, about the subject matter, the location, Antarctica in your case, as opposed to, oh, I already know this. I'm the person who knows about X, right? I know that for me, some of my best work has been jumping into, I'll give the one example, Extreme Makeover Home Edition. I was never interested or even knew how to design anything, but yet I came in and did some of my best work. Do you feel like because you had never been to Antarctica and didn't know anything about it, that you were able to dig in and succeed?
Do you know what I think? As a filmmaker, I think I appreciate both situations. Like, I think I really appreciated when the first time I went to Antarctica, and I really didn't know anything about it. And generally, I'd been kind of, honestly, been thinking to myself, I don't think that's somewhere I want to go. But then to go there without any kind of preconceptions really was, I mean, it was life-changing in lots and lots of ways. And I think that, you know, in the movie Endurance, there's a scene where I'm interviewing the head of the expedition, the expedition director, and he's someone who has, you know, been to Antarctica, I think 25 times or something. And he describes going to Antarctica as being like a drug. And when he said that to me, I just felt really seen. Like it was exactly the same as the experience that I had the first time I went to Antarctica. Like I became obsessed with this place that I maybe it's partly because I didn't know much about it before I went, and it's such an overwhelming experience to go there. Just everything is overwhelming in terms of the isolation that you feel from your friends and family and the real world. You're just completely cut off. If you don't want to read the news or hear the news, you can do that for months and months and months on end. You can be completely cut off from the real world if you choose to. But then you also have the intensity of like the community that you find there. And that's what my first film in Antarctica was about. It was kind of about, what does it take for humans to survive in this level of isolation, in this kind of harsh environment? It's, we have to learn to rely on each other, and we have to learn to look after each other. And this incredibly beautiful sort of form of community is born, which I think we don't really see so much in our modern world back home. So I think I have made lots of films where I've known nothing about the subject matter beforehand. I mean, most of my science films, as we've discussed. And I think that's one of the things I absolutely love about my job. And it feels like one of the biggest privileges about my job is that I get to just keep exploring the world. Like every project I do, I'm learning something. And that is just, I think maybe I'm addicted to that. I love it. I love that about my work. I'm always learning about whether it's a subject or people or the world around me. I think it's such a joy. But I also think, and interestingly, endurance is perhaps fits into this category. Like one of the reasons I wanted to make endurance was because by the time it got to 2021 and I got that phone call, I had been obsessed with Antarctica for like many years. And I had been really deeply involved in lots of the kind of polar community activities, both in the UK and sort of further afield as well. And I'd become very passionate and very interested in telling stories from that place. And I think that is because I think it's a place that so few people will ever go to, but it's also a place that does have a dramatic effect on all of our everyday lives. And so I think coming to endurance, it wasn't a topic that I knew nothing about. It was certainly something that I had a really vested interest in. And that's a different kind of enjoyment, I think, when you get to make a film about something you're really passionate about and lots about. And I think sometimes, especially because filming endurance was extremely challenging. I basically had to organize a mini expedition as well as a film shoot, as well as, like everything else that was going on. So having a bit of a head start on that was definitely a good thing.
Okay, so let's dig into Endurance, the film. It's with National Geographic, which if you're going to do an adventure documentary, this is the brand to do it with. So talk to me a little bit about the genesis of the project.
Yeah. So, I mean, the search for Endurance has been ongoing. Obviously, since she sank over 100 years ago, everyone has wanted to know where she is and what happened to her. And, for many, many years, it's just been completely impossible to look for her because the technology simply didn't exist. And back in 2019, actually, John Shears and Menson Bound, who appear in the film, they made the first attempt to go and find her. And they sadly failed. But I remember I'm part of a consultation group that's part of the UK Parliament here, and it's a consultation group for the polar regions. And I remember going to a meeting of this group back in 2019 when they got back from that expedition, and they presented to this group in Parliament the expedition that they'd done to try and find Endurance. And I remember sitting there thinking, my goodness, I had no idea this was happening. This is amazing. I wish I'd been there to film it. And I mean, like there was a different documentary that was made about that expedition, but that their search really did start many, many years ago. And then, obviously lots of different things happened. COVID happened, all kinds of things happened. And then in the summer of 2021, I got a phone call from the production company, and it's a guy called Dan Snow who appears in the film, and he is an executive producer on the film. And he phoned me up, and we've known each other for a really long time, for like years and years and years. And he phoned me up and he said, so we are potentially going to work with the Endurance 22 expedition. They want a whole bunch of media coverage. They want we had Dan and a couple of amazing producers on the ship with us who were doing social media, all kinds of social media content, podcasts, online documentaries, TikToks, Instagram, Twitter. It was amazing. Like their rate of output was incredible. And he said, but we also want to make a documentary, and we need a director, and we need someone who can both direct the documentary and head up the entire media kind of campaign for this expedition. And I obviously thought for about 3 seconds before I was like, definitely, yes, I want to do this. I'd kind of been trying to get back to Antarctica for quite a few years, and it's quite difficult to do. So I was immediately like, yes, I'd love to do it. But really, you know, that was the start. And within a couple of weeks, I was on a plane to the south of France to meet the kind of expedition leadership team and some of the team who operate the underwater drones, the underwater vehicles, and see them kind of doing all their testing and preparations for the expedition. And it was just me at that point. It was just me. And I kind of, you know, the expedition were kind of funding this material, this kind of the filming and the content. And I had to kind of come up with a plan for what this film would be and how we were going to make it. Whilst also planning my own like mini expedition to Antarctica and trying to find a crew who I could take with me, because we had such limited space on the expedition ship. I could only have 2 crew with me. And so I decided to take 2 cinematographers. And obviously I shoot myself as well. So just because from that first trip to France, I realized a number of extremely important things. One was that these guys were going to be searching 24 hours a day for like over a month. And we can't just have one camera to cover all of that. There's just no way. The other thing is that the control hut from where they control the underwater vehicle is so small you can barely fit in there. And I realized that we would never be able to have a camera operator stationed in there permanently, and I'd need to rig it instead. So there were lots of things that were really impactful and important from, you know, the start. You know, my first day on the job, I was in France and sort of trying to get my head around this, I mean, incredibly complicated expedition, but also what was this film going to be, and what did I want it to be, and also therefore how was I going to film this, and how could I bring all those pieces together. And so we went off on the expedition, and honestly at the end of the time in France, I sort of thought to myself, I'm not sure they're going to find the shipwreck. Everything broke all the time. Like they were working with like the cutting edge technology, like the latest tech, and they'd never used it before. And it kept breaking. Everything kept going wrong. And I was kind of like, most of them hadn't worked in Antarctica before, had never been to Antarctica before. And I was kind of thinking to myself, you know, we're in sunny south of France. Like, it's really beautiful here and it's lovely and sunny and warm. And I was like, oh my gosh, if it's not working here, how are we going to get on in Antarctica? But I did also think to myself, like, I'd never seen a team who was so good at teamwork, who was so collaborative, who was so dedicated to working together to find creative solutions to problems. And they were tireless. They worked tirelessly. And I did think, you know, this feels like a massive shot in the dark, but if anyone is going to be able to find this shipwreck, then it's these guys. Like, they are the best in the world, and they're absolutely incredible. So so we went off on the expedition, and I had food poisoning for the few days before the expedition. So I was not feeling great when we left Cape Town on the ship. And it was really, really tough. But we kind of filmed, and then it wasn't until kind of there were announcements on the news like a few months later, that's when Nat Geo kind of we approached a few like people with the story, and that's when Nat Geo, you know, were like, just they loved it and was so keen to come on board. So it was a kind of really an unusual way of the film coming about and coming together. But, you know, I mean, searching for the Endurance is an unusual thing to do, so I guess it kind of fits, you know.
That's incredible. I give you a lot of credit for being bold enough to jump in there before a buyer was on board, not knowing that this could be commissioned. And like you said, you didn't know whether they were going to find it. You didn't know what the end result was. That's very commendable. I give you a lot of credit for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I just, you know, I am just captivated by adventure stories, by going on adventures myself. Like, it is, my heart is to go on adventures and to tell the world about these kind of stories where people are trying to do something that may well be impossible. Like, as we left Cape Town, like, all of the press over here in the UK was like, it's the impossible shipwreck. You know, they're never going to find it. And I think it's, you know, and it is not surprising that most broadcasters wouldn't take a risk on that. It was a highly, in my opinion, highly unlikely that they would ever find it, or find any results. But I think for me, those stories are fascinating because it's the types of people who are willing to undertake projects like that, I find really interesting. I think that they have a really interesting view on the world. I think they've probably had some very interesting experiences which have brought them to this place where they are willing to take risks and they're willing to really try and push themselves to the edge of their capabilities and their experience. And that for me is a really interesting thing to be sort of filming and telling stories about, because I think that's where magic happens, like when people push themselves beyond what they think they can do. And I think, sometimes I feel like that when taking on projects like this. When I took on the project, it was like I had maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 months to prep this entire thing, to develop the whole film whilst also planning the expedition, whilst also like doing insane training courses, like learning how to like survive if our ship turned into a shipwreck, it was crazy. It was a crazy time getting ready for the expedition, and also getting to know the people that I was going to be filming and trying to figure out what the story was here and how we were going to tell it. I think I kind of I have some affinities with people who try and do stuff like that, I think.
Let's take one step back and talk about the original Endurance, the ship that was headed out to traverse Antarctica, right? Then in 1914, Sir Ernest Shackleton, the expedition leader, makes this glorious journey out there. And so this is kind of the genesis of this story, right? So tell me a little bit about Ernest Shackleton and kind of how you wanted to tell. You're basically telling 2 stories in this film. And is that, as you said, you had 3 months really to kind of prep this story. How did you think about Shackleton's story, this famous explorer, along with your present day famous explorers, and how you wanted to intertwine those?
I had obviously been aware of the Shackleton story, pretty much most of my life. I mean, here in the UK, he's kind of like a mythical figure, like everyone's pretty much heard of him, and whether you knows the story to different extents. But the first time I went to Antarctica back in 2016, I think I learned a lot more about the story. And actually, I was fortunate enough to have dinner with Shackleton's granddaughter, Zaz Shackleton, who is an amazing woman. And, I remember listening to her talk about her grandfather over dinner, and just her passion for him and his work and his story was really impactful for me. And I think kind of made it feel so much more personal and so much more interesting. And so I knew the Shackleton story very well, but I didn't have time to do the level of in-depth research that I wanted to do in that kind of pre-production phase before we went on the expedition. But what I did know, and what I did sort of realize I wanted to do, was to look for the synergies between the 2 stories and look for the ways that the sort of themes and ideas that Shackleton and his men and their story kind of explores kind of would show up in the modern day expedition. And I think there's, Shackleton's family motto is "By endurance we conquer," and that's why he named the ship Endurance. And I think that for me was a really strong guiding principle for filming the modern expedition, because so much of what that modern expedition was about was kind of like endurance, in the face of overwhelming odds, which is just exactly it's the same sort of concept that Shackleton and his men faced, although obviously for Shackleton and his men it was much more serious. But there were lots and lots of parallels, there were lots of synergies, and I think that as a filmmaker is wonderful, because it, I think it speaks to some of the human condition. I think it shows that we all face difficult circumstances in our lives, whether you're trying to find the Endurance or you're trying to cross Antarctica or you're just trying to, get through the day, quite frankly. We all can kind of recognize those emotions to a greater or lesser extent. And I think that's really important when, as an audience, when you're watching a film, to be able to find these touch points where you can relate to a story that's as, honestly wild and incredible as Shackleton's. And then I think there was also something about kind of teamwork and about leadership, which you see in the Shackleton story, which I think we really lived on the modern expedition. And yeah, I knew that I wanted the modern expedition to tell their story as though you're there with them. I think what Shackleton was an incredible visionary for his time, because he knew that unless you have photos and video of it, like, it hasn't happened. You know, we all know that now because we're all on social media, and we know that unless there's a photo, it didn't happen. No one will believe you. And Shackleton got that over 100 years ago, and he had the foresight and the vision to take a documentary cameraman with him who did all this film and photography work, and I really wanted to sort of, you know, I think he bared incredible witness to what they went through and to their journey, and I'm still in awe of Hurley. And I really wanted to try and do the same for the people on the modern expedition, to really bear witness to them and what they were doing and what they achieved and how they worked. So yeah, I think that's kind of how it all started, really.
I'm glad you brought up the original footage. How did you go about blending Frank Hurley's original photographs and archival footage with your own and your cinematographers, you know, to kind of make it seamless?
Yeah, I mean, it was really honestly challenging. And, you know, we spent a lot of time talking and experimenting and thinking and, you know, trying to figure out the best way of doing it. But I think Hurley's footage is so remarkable. You know, I still cannot believe that he achieved what he achieved. You know, many people consider South, which is the film that he released, you know, after they got back from the Endurance expedition, to be sort of one of the first feature documentaries ever in the world. And the fact that he made that in Antarctica, so like the hardest place in the world to film, and during an expedition where basically really everyone should have died, like, the fact that he achieved the first ever feature documentary in those conditions still blows my mind, and I can't quite get over it, quite frankly. But I think, you know, we really wanted to try and bring his footage to life for a modern audience, and we talked about lots of different ways to do that. We actually hired a lip reader to see if we could lip read any of the words that people were saying in Hurley's footage, and we could get like a couple of bits here and there, but actually a lot of the footage that he shot is quite far away, so it's very difficult to see people, and obviously people have like masks over their faces or balaclavas and stuff because it's so cold, so it was actually really difficult. And then we obviously had lots of conversations with the BFI, the British Film Institute here, about potentially recolorizing it, and obviously that's something that had never been done before. The BFI did an incredible job, or do an incredible job, of preserving, and actually they kind of digitized Hurley's footage a few years ago, but you know, it had never been properly colorized. It had been there's a technique called tint and tone, which they used to use back in the kind of 20s when South came out. And actually, when the BFI came to restore South, they found like tens and tens of different copies, different versions of it. There was no kind of one coherent version that had been shown everywhere or used everywhere, because it was kind of used as a lecture film as opposed to like a proper cinema thing. And so all these different versions, and some of them had this tint and tone on, which is where they, the filmmakers of the time, would put like a blue tint or a green tint or an orange tint over the black and white footage on particular scenes to kind of try and denote where, like, what the light or colors of that footage would be like. So for example, if you were filming in a forest, you'd make it a green tint, or if you were filming kind of outside in the sunshine, you make it a blue tint to be kind of like bright sunshine. And so some of the versions had tint and tone, and I think in a way that was really inspiring from us, because it, you know, I think Hurley would have wanted to colorize. You know, he was trying to colorize his footage back in the day, but they, you know, he was just using the technology that was available to him at the time. And so, you know, for us to then be able to do that afresh now with the technology that's available today, I think was really special. But I mean, one of the biggest challenges of this film is that Hurley's film footage finishes when the ship sinks, because he had to leave his film camera behind. He could only take his stills camera with him. And unfortunately, in the story, the ship sinks quite early on. And so we kind of found ourselves in this place where we're like, oh, we've got a really big chunk of story where there's no original footage. And obviously we had photos, but, you know, there's still a lot of story to tell and to try and communicate and to try and visualize. And so we had lots of discussions about, we did a massive archive search looking for any and all film that had been made about this story, that had been shot in Antarctica back at that time. And actually, I was really surprised about how many filmmakers were going to Antarctica back at that time. Like, there were actually quite a few, that the Japanese were there and the Australians, and they were all filming their expeditions. And so we kind of had this big wealth of archive which we could draw on to try and help visualize certain parts of the story. But even with that, we still had gaps. And so then we knew we needed to sort of find ways to visually recreate scenes. And it was the challenge is to try and make all of that diverse material feel like one body, one sort of story. And that was really challenging, especially as, you can't, you don't have the time and the money to recreate every single thing you want to do, especially when it's supposed to be in Antarctica or in boats and in a storm. And, it's a really time consuming and expensive thing to film. So, yeah, it was a real challenge. But I think, we're really pleased with how it came out. And, I think I'll never get tired of watching Hurley's footage. I'll just never tire of it and never stop being in awe of him. He's amazing.
You mentioned technology and how you're adapting the old photos and footage for modern times. Can you tell me about some of the other innovative technologies that you used on this film, specifically maybe bringing back voice or recreating voices from Shackleton and his team?
Yeah, so as a filmmaker, I'm someone who I like to kind of allow ideas to percolate in my brain for a really long time. And I think the way I wanted to tell the Shackleton part of the story really did, I was so busy in the first half of kind of filming, trying to capture the modern expedition, that I kind of was still percolating what I wanted for the other part of the film. And it wasn't until I got back from the expedition that I really felt like I could have dedicated time to spend on that. And I spent months and months and months actually reading thousands of pages of diaries and letters and transcripts and trawling through archives up and down the country. I had two incredible people working with me. I had an assistant producer called Cameron and an amazing archive producer. And I was visiting family members of like the people who were on the original Endurance expedition. They were so kind to us. They let me kind of go through their cupboards and their archives looking for, never before seen archive material. I found these songs that the men wrote on when they were living on Elephant Island, and we uncovered these radio interviews that had been done with the men when they returned and sort of in the years after they returned. And between myself and Cameron, we read every single diary that the men had written during this time. And it was incredible to be able to immerse myself in that and to really feel like I was getting to know these men and who they were and what they were like. And at the same time, I was also obviously watching everything and anything that had ever been made about Shackleton and the Endurance expedition. And I started to realize that there was kind of this dissonance that I was kind of picking up on between the men that I was kind of seeing in the diaries and in the interviews that they gave, and then the way that they and their story was portrayed in some of these films where, they were modern films. So they obviously couldn't interview the guys who'd actually been there because they'd all passed on by then. But you kind of had modern people who weren't on that expedition telling the story of the expedition. And it just didn't have the nuance that I saw in the diaries. It didn't have the kind of moments of levity or the sort of, different layers that I felt you got from the diaries and from hearing the men's actual words. And I felt like these people who weren't there, they kind of made everything sound like everything was bad all the time. Whereas when you read the men's diaries, it was like they were having a hilarious time. Like I often say to people, as someone who goes on expeditions, like I don't go on an expedition expecting everything to go well. I kind of go on expeditions because I kind of know something's probably going to go wrong. And then I will need to figure out what I can do about that and like either live with it or find a solution. And I think that is obviously super challenging. And it's something that is a challenge that I really enjoy. I think it's similar to filmmaking. It's one of those things where filmmaking never goes as you think it's going to go. And there's always a challenge, and you always have to pivot and change and kind of evolve as you go along. And I think that was the thing that was really missing from these modern people telling the story. And so I kind of started talking to the rest of the team about how I was really, really wanted to find a way for the men to tell their own stories. And I actually ended up having a conversation with one of the executive producers who told me about a film that was just about to be released, and it was about the creator of a kind of kids kind of show from the UK from back in the day called The Thunderbirds, and the guy who created it is called Jerry Anderson, and they'd made this film about him. He was quite an interesting and unusual man, and they'd actually used AI both to recreate his voice but also to recreate his likeness. And honestly, when he first told me about it, I kind of felt a bit uncomfortable about that. I wasn't quite sure what I thought. I was, as I think there's so many conversations we need to have about using AI as as filmmakers and just in society. And I just wasn't quite sure what I thought, but I started to think, well, for what we're trying to do, we have these samples of the men's voices, and we have them telling part of their own story, but we don't have all of it. And there's other parts that they never spoke about on the radio or on TV, but they wrote about. And so could we find a way to help them tell those parts in their own voice? And we got in touch with this incredible company in the Ukraine called Respeecher, who are an ethical AI company. And we sort of said to them, we're really interested to see if this is possible. Like, we've got their diaries, we've got their own words. We're not putting words into their mouths. We're just using their own words. Is it possible to hear them say those words in their voices? And we did some testing. And I remember sort of having to go through these diaries and select these sort of pieces of text to send to Respeecher to say, can you make Shackleton say this in his own voice? And, can Greenstreet talk about this in his voice? And they had it for a couple of weeks and they sent back these tests, and it was amazing. It was really special because it felt like this was a possibility. We could enable these men to tell their own stories for the first time in, decades. And that felt, for me, like a really important thing to do, and a really lovely parallel to the modern expedition participants who were telling their story. We had the luxury of being able to interview the modern expedition participants and get them to tell their story. And so this felt like a way of making it equal and enabling those men to tell their story as well.
I produce an AI podcast, a podcast about AI. So I'm fascinated by this. So
right.
Yeah, I love that you did this. Did you have to go to all of these men's families or their estates and get approval? Can you talk about the approval process? Because I know in my research and in working with this AI company that I do, that is a big part of this is, okay, we want to use your voice or we want to use your likeness. Okay, how do we do this in a way? You use the word ethical. How do we do this so that we're not stealing anything?
Yeah, I mean, it was really important to us to involve the descendants of the Shackleton family and the other members of the Endurance Expedition as much as we could. Obviously, filmmaking is a really complicated and long process, but, I started to meet, even when we were on the ship in Antarctica, we were already in touch with descendants of the original Endurance, because actually they still, I've never met people who are still so invested in their family's story and the legacy as people whose relatives were on the Endurance. It really is this incredible legacy that I've not seen anywhere else, where the level of engagement with the story and with telling that story and telling it to keeping it in the public domain and helping people to access it, I've never seen anything like it. And so they were already contacting the expedition before we even set off. And so we had already started that work of being in touch with family members, because actually, it really mattered to them to find out what happened to this ship, which basically saved the lives of their family forefathers. They were already invested in the expedition. And so when we got back and we started sort of working on putting the film together, we carried on that process and just tried to track down descendants from any and all expedition members that we could find. And we had we've got a list of loads and loads and loads and loads. And I was so lucky to speak to many of them and to spend time with some of them. And it's so fascinating to hear the stories that they have, that their grandfathers did tell them, or their sort of relatives did tell them. But it's also really interesting that some of them said, my grandfather or my relative didn't necessarily talk about it that much. And actually some of the members of the endurance expedition had this thing where they would meet up like once a year or once every couple of years, and they'd all have a reunion, and they would talk about it there, and then they would go home and not talk about it for the rest of the year. And I thought that was fascinating because I kind of wondered what was behind that. And one of the relatives that I was talking to said that she felt it was probably because they didn't think anyone else could understand. Like if they tried to explain it to anyone, they wouldn't understand. And I can kind of get that, because I think when you go on expeditions, when you have these really intense experiences, I guess it's like making a film with people, you know, like when you have these really intense experiences, it's very difficult to explain them to people who weren't there. So I think that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of archive recordings or interviews with them, because I think I guess they felt maybe like it's just impossible to explain this to anyone. But yeah, it was so important to us to do this in consultation with them, and, you know, to really respect the fact that, you know, we're bringing this story to modern audiences afresh, which I think is really important. But, you know, these are their family members, and this is, you know, it is their story as well. So yeah, we were really, really grateful to all of them for everything they did to help us.
All right, I have to ask you one more question about AI. Did you get any pushback from Nat Geo or Disney, you know, the parent company?
Yeah, do you know what? It's a really good question. And I think it is really important that people do engage with these things and don't just kind of wave them through and whatever. But actually, everyone was very supportive. I think we all went into it with a kind of mindset of, I don't know if this is going to work, and I don't know if this is the right thing, but let's see what's possible and keep examining it and talking about it and re-examining it and re-evaluating it as we go along, and just keep checking yourself. I think that's something I do as a filmmaker anyway. Even, you know, if I'm not using AI, even if it's just, how am I portraying this contributor, or how am I telling this story? Like, how am I ordering this film, like structuring this film? I think you're always, for me, I'm always, as you say, we're concerned with truth. And I think, you know, if we had got to a stage where we felt like this didn't feel truthful to the men and to their story and to you know, their words, or, you know, kind of if it felt like it was straying from the truth, I think we would have, you know, had to think differently about it. But actually, I think, you know, obviously Nat Geo, we were telling them about everything we were doing, and we were telling them about the experience we were doing, and we were telling them about the results, and like they were coming out amazing, and they were super, super supportive. Obviously they were super interested. But yeah, we didn't ever hit a point where we were like, oh, this is a problem. It just kind of evolved and grew. And I think we all went into it quite cautiously, and we're really pleased that actually we felt it worked, and it brings something to the film, which I find really magical.
Okay, I have to ask you about filming, because the temperatures you're dealing with, you're on a boat, it's an unpredictable situation you're in, and you don't know what's going to happen in terms of the arcs of your story. Tell me a little bit about how you're structuring your days, and also the gear you're using, because the temperatures, you could, you know, your media could freeze, your cameras could freeze. I just did a shoot, and my iPhone, is the opposite. The temperatures were so hot, my iPhone shut down. So talk to me a little bit about the struggles you had filming, but how you, being a vet of dealing with Antarctica and the temperatures and whatnot, how did you overcome some of these struggles?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was one of the most challenging shoots I think I've ever done. There were kind of challenges in every level. And actually, it's really funny because when I was thinking about recording this podcast today, I thought that actually the title of this podcast is so appropriate, because as we left Cape Town on the ship, one of my cinematographers said to me, I had two incredible cinematographers with me. One is an amazing documentary cinematographer called James Blake, and the other is actually a narrative cinematographer called Paul Morris. And Paul's partner is a director of narrative films, and he was saying to me, oh yeah, you know, my girlfriend was asking me, you know, what the script is like, and I'd said to her, oh no, there is no script. And she was like actually horrified. She was like visibly horrified, and she was like, what do you mean there's no script? And he's like, well, you know, it's a documentary, there is no script. And she was like, all right, well, is there like a storyboard? And he was like, you know, there's no storyboard. There's no storyboard. And she was just like, what? And he was like, yeah. And she was like, are you not absolutely terrified? And he was like, oh, you know, but like Nat knows what she's doing. It's fine. And he's telling me this, like, as we pull out of the harbour, you know, going to Antarctica. And I'm sitting there being like, yeah, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. I'm just like trying to convince myself it's going to be fine. And I think, you know, I mean, the first film that I shot was in Antarctica, and it was the same thing. Like, I had no idea what was going to happen from day to day. Like, everything changed probably hourly, and it was like nothing I'd ever done before. It was chaos, and it was very stressful, but it also taught me so much about storytelling and about filming verite, you know. I mean, and I think it's one of the things I absolutely love about making these films is like, I don't know what's going to happen. So I just have to rely on my gut instinct to follow what I think is the thing to do that day. And, you know, we had super limited resources, and, you know, I only had a tiny team. There's like 3 of us trying to film a crew of over 100 people who are working 24 hours a day. I mean, you know, you'd usually want a crew of like 20 to 50 people to film that. And we had 3 of us. And I was like, I had to make decisions all the time about what you do and don't get. And I also, you know, we also had the challenge of the guys we were filming, although the expedition said they wanted this documentary crew to come with them, you know, a lot of the guys that we were filming had had really bad experiences with the media in the past, and they were very wary about having us around. And I did loads and loads and loads of work in the months leading up to the expedition to try and help them to understand the film that I wanted to make and who I am as a director. Because I think, you know, when you're working with people who've had a very bad experience of the media, it's really important to help them understand that not everyone who works in filmmaking is the same. Not everyone who works in the media is the same. And that it doesn't have to be the same. And that actually, if we can collaborate, if we can all communicate about what we want, what we're worried about, what we need from each other, then you can actually make something which everyone is happy about and proud of. But there is a huge amount of trust that you have to build in order to do that. And especially for these guys, you know, they're trying to do something that had never been done before. And that's really, really hard. And it involves a lot of failure. And people don't like being filmed failing. Like, it's not a nice feeling. And certainly it took me a long time to kind of help those guys to get to know me and to know that I wasn't there to, you know, kind of stitch them up and make them look stupid, but also that I wanted to be truthful about how we told their story. So that was a huge challenge. And I think linked to that is the challenge of living with the people that you're filming on a ship in the middle of nowhere. Like, that was so hard because they are very, very stressed. You know, when you're on an expedition and things are going wrong and everyone is exhausted and they are very stressed. And then I am there asking the difficult questions and still filming them when things are going wrong. And then they can't even go home at the end of the day and say, oh my goodness, that director was so annoying. They have to kind of have dinner with me. And then I see them at breakfast the next morning, and then I see them at lunch, and I'm just following around all the time. They can't escape. They can't get in their car and drive away. Like, I know where their cabin is, you know, and navigating that dynamic is incredibly difficult, like incredibly hard. Yeah, that was a huge, huge challenge, but they were so welcoming to us, actually. And I think one of the reasons that we got the footage we did is because from the outset, we all agreed, as the kind of I was on the senior leadership team for the expedition, we all agreed that the media team and the film team needed to feel like they were absolutely part of the expedition. They couldn't be this sort of like thing on the side. They had to be completely integrated into it. So we had to do all the stuff that the other expedition team members had to do. We had to do all the training they had to do. We had to do all the kind of, you know, requirements, meet all the requirements that they did. And we had to feel like we were part of the team. And I think for me, that is one of the reasons that we were able to capture so much incredible stuff. But it was hard, you know. Living on a ship in Antarctica is difficult, and it was freezing. It was very, very cold outside. Like, I remember coming down one morning and my wonderful cinematographer James, his eyelashes had frozen because he'd been outside filming. I think they'd been launching the underwater drone at like 5 o'clock in the morning or something, and I came down at like 6, and he'd been out there filming the whole time. And I was like, James, your eyelashes are frozen. I think you might need to go inside. Like, do you want me to take over for a bit? You go inside and warm up. And he's like, no, I'm fine. I'm like, no, like, we need you to to get warm. Like, it's like, and, you know, I mean, having done a lot of kind of extreme environment shoots, like, you know, you learn what works for you when you're operating a camera in those environments. But I have my very own like glove system that I use when I'm filming in very cold environments. It's really tragic, isn't it? But you can't wear those big giant gloves that are going to keep you really warm when you go skiing or when you go hiking in the snow, because you simply can't operate a camera with them on. So you have to just kind of figure out these kind of Heath Robinson solutions to all these problems. And also you have to take just spares of everything, because everything breaks. We were quite lucky with our cameras, actually. We were shooting on the FX6, mostly because at one point there was a high possibility we were going to be using helicopter operations as part of the expedition. And so everything we took had to be under a certain weight limit. So we were really restricted with what cameras we could use that we thought would both survive the cold and be really lightweight if we needed to move to helicopter operations. And the FX6s actually held up really, really well. They did a really good job. We had one which went a little bit funny, like the LCD screen went a bit weird, and there was a kind of a bit of a funny thing. I think the cold started to affect one of them, but actually most of them were okay. One of the biggest problems we had actually was with the lav mic cables. They kind of broke. I think they just got so cold because they're so thin. I think they just kind of got so cold they kind of snapped quite a lot. And by the end of the expedition, we only had about like 3 microphones that were still working. It was getting close. But generally, yeah, the kit held up pretty well. I was impressed. Yeah, we just about got away with it, I think.
You should end up teaching a class on how to film in extreme cold, like in the extreme cold.
How to be cold. I'm very good at being cold. But also to say, do you know, one of the biggest challenges I actually think for filming this expedition was just like lack of sleep, because we were like, you know, I basically, when it went into 24-hour working, I put my 2 cinematographers on like 12-hour shifts. So their shift pattern reflected the shift pattern of the team. And I would do this like giant shift that would sort of like overlap the two from like 6 a.m. to about 9 o'clock at night. And then it just felt like every time I tried to go to bed, they would need to reposition the ship. So we were obviously living on this icebreaker, and basically trying to sleep when an icebreaker is breaking ice is a bit like trying to sleep through an extremely powerful earthquake that goes on for like 3 hours. And so no matter when I tried to get sleep, whether it was like, you know, at the end of my day and I'd try and go to bed, the ship would start moving. And like, I actually had to do this thing where I had to like wedge stuff under my mattress so that the side of the mattress lifted up and kind of pushed me against the walls, so I didn't kind of get bounced out of bed while I was trying to sleep. Like, getting sleep was basically impossible. And by the end of the expedition, some of the contributors that you see in the film, so Menson, who you see in the film, he was actually getting the ship's doctor to check on me because I was so exhausted. He thought, he was like, I'm really worried about Nat. She's so exhausted. Like, I hadn't slept for days, if not weeks, by the end. And I just looked so ill. They were all just like, oh my God. So yeah, the doctor kept checking on me because I just didn't get any sleep for a really long time. And I think that, and you know, when you're so tired that your judgment, you know, just it slows down and you're kind of second guessing yourself and you're not sure you're doing the right thing. And yeah, it was tough. Like the last kind of week and a half was really tough.
I hope that you're sleeping now because you certainly have earned it.
Thank you.
and the film turned out great. Everybody should watch it. Endurance is streaming on Disney Plus, and people can watch it on National Geographic. Anything else you want to tell people about Endurance?
Just that I hope you watch it. I hope that when you watch it, it brings you some hope for your life, whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through, or may face in the future. I think it's an incredible story of the abilities of the human spirit to persevere in the face of huge challenges. And yeah, I think we could all do with that at some point in our lives. So yeah, I really hope that if you need that you find some hope in this film.
I think we all could use a little hope now.
Right.
I think that is a fantastic message. So thank you so much for doing No Script, No Problem.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great. It's been so great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks again to Natalie Hewit. You can catch her film Endurance on Nat Geo, Disney Plus, or Hulu. Now, before I go, tomorrow is the 2024 American election. Naturally, as you can expect, I'm going for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. For Senate in California, I'm going with Adam Schiff, and I'm going to encourage all of my listeners in Ohio, where I'm from, to vote for Sherrod Brown. Now, as for Trump, having produced 15 years of reality TV, here's my 2 cents on the reality TV president, now former president, hoping to be president again. Donald Trump's potential second term as president raises terrifying concerns across multiple fronts. His fascist rhetoric and narcissism have consistently undermined democratic institutions, from suggesting the termination of constitutional articles to praising autocratic leaders to his alleged mishandling of classified documents. Former generals and staff who worked in his administration have said he poses a national security risk. One has even accused him of being a fascist. Furthermore, Trump's role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, as detailed by the House committee, included his alleged incitement of the insurrection and failure to act during the violence. This further exemplifies his disregard for the law. Trump's economic policies, including proposed tariffs and Project 2025, could lead to job losses and economic instability. Project 2025's proposals to abolish the Federal Reserve and potentially return to a gold-backed currency could cause severe economic disruption. Dozens of esteemed economists have stated that the Harris economic plan will be better for Americans than Trump's. His stance on climate change, denying its existence, and proposing cuts to renewable energy research threatens long-term environmental sustainability. Additionally, Trump's concept of a plan for healthcare, particularly women's reproductive rights, will result in even more restricted access to essential services like abortion. His 3 Supreme Court appointments in his first term were instrumental in overturning Roe v. Wade, and a second term could further solidify conservative control over reproductive rights for decades. Throughout his career, Trump has faced numerous lawsuits for not paying contractors, had his foundation and university found to be fraudulent, and had 6 businesses go into bankruptcy. Moreover, his endeavors like Trump Steaks, Trump Vodka, and Trump Ties have all failed. And don't forget, Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic was widely criticized by public health experts, raising concerns about his ability to manage future crises. These factors, combined with his history of controversial business dealings, specifically with foreign nations, present a compelling case for voters to choose Kamala Harris as president. Trump's pattern of authoritarian language, disrespect for military service, and encouragement of political violence further underscore the potential risks of his second President Trump term. It's crucial for Americans to research thoroughly, fact-check claims, and make informed decisions based on credible sources and information. All right, that's going to do it for another episode of No Script, No Problem. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, download, and rate it with 5 stars. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Podcast, Stitcher, and TuneIn. You can also find it at Believe.com and at Believe Podcast. Follow me on X at Steve Berkowitz and Threads or Instagram at Steve M. Berkowitz. You can also send any questions you have to noscriptnoproblempodcast@gmail.com. If you're interested in advertising on the show, please contact Believe at Believe.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Steve Berkowitz for No Script, No Problem.